Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I am joined, as always, by my comrade and faithful co-host, Misty Winston. And today we're happy to have back on the show our good friend, our comrade as well, and a past guest, Danny Sjursen. He's a former Army major. He is a former professor of history at West Point. He's the author of the book Patriotic Descent, which I highly recommend. He's also a frequent contributor to antiwar.com, and we're going to talk about one of his most recent pieces today. And that has to do with AFRICOM and the expanding imperialism associated with that organization. So Danny, thanks so much for joining us once again.
Oh, always a pleasure to come on. And just the fact that you guys talk about these things that I write about is kind of nice, because sometimes it feels like when you write about Africa in particular, you're like screaming into the wilderness and you're like, man, that was a clever way I phrased that. And then you say, but nobody cares, so it's nice. Right. Recently, I've been able to talk about this on a number of shows, and it seems like it takes a crisis or a major event like a death, or in this case, maybe a killing. Well, definitely a killing, just a question of who did it, to get this going. And so I'm just glad to talk about it.
So your most recent piece is titled, is it Debbie's or Davies? Debbie's.
I always say Debbie, but that is interesting because I've written his name probably like 450 times in the last 4 weeks, and I've never once taken the time to look it up. I probably should explore what that says about
me. Who cares?
So, I mean, he conscripts child soldiers. Like, I'm not that worried about it, but no,
right.
But yeah, I'm not. I say Debbie, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it's something in the French to a certain extent. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so your most recent piece on antiwar.com is Debbie's Death, Chad's Crisis, and the Ghosts of Libyan Fiascos Past. And let's start with who Debbie, if that's how it's pronounced, who he was and what happened to him.
So he was the almost 31 year tenured president, right? And I mean, president almost needs to go in quotes. I mean, these are presidents for life of Chad. And funny thing about Chad, it just occurred to me that Chad was kind of like a big story in the 80s, and we're going to get to that because of the proxy and physical overt war between, the government of Chad with French support, like French soldiers died there, and CIA backing from the United States with Libya's Gaddafi. And then I remember there's like a movie, and I believe it might have been 1993. And it was, do you remember when Pauly Shore made movies and people actually watched them?
Yes.
Well, there was a movie called In the Army Now. And they him and his stoner buddy joined the army to whatever, get some money for college or just whatever, a bonus. And they get deployed. They don't expect they're actually going to deploy they're in the reserves, and they end up deploying to Chad because Libya is invading Chad. And, so it just made me think of that. So Chad is this largely desert country. The entire northern half is basically fairly barren, nomadic people up there. About 90% of the people live in the south. It is a former French colony, currently a French proxy, has been a French proxy really forever. The French have both supported dictators or quasi-dictators there since its inception as a country in 1960, which is kind of a colonial creation. And then when they were no longer useful, helped depose the same strongmen. And Debbie has been their favorite for 31 years. He became important, and Chad became really important again, and more than ever around the time of 9/11, but especially since the Boko Haram uprising in the southwest of Chad along Lake Chad. Of course, across that lake, which is shrinking immensely due to climate change, the genesis of that revolution or that Islamist rebellion is in Nigeria, but it's spilled over into Chad. And then with the uprising in Mali, which then spread to Burkina Faso, Niger, basically the entire Sahel to the direct west of Chad. Chad became an island of stability, they said, but it was never stable. And they subcontracted their troops out. So Debbie was really useful to Paris. So much so that they let him get treatment there when he was sick. and he was trained there when he was in the army because he came to power in a military coup.
Sort of like the Shah.
He was a really useful guy to the French, but what changed around 2012-13 is he became really useful to the Americans too, because what he is he provides guns for hire. So, we could talk about it later. We can go in a big circle, clockwise or counterclockwise, from the north of Chad, and every single country it borders, Chad either has troops deployed there on different kinds of multinational missions, or in some cases unilateral missions, or is involved in some sort of proxy conflict. So most of that is done at the bidding of France, with a key assist, John Stockton on the Utah Jazz in the 90s style from the United States. And so it's an interesting dynamic in Africa where America may call the shots, may have more power, or may think it calls the shots, but France has more troops on the ground, a little more skin in the game, and is way more overtly imperialist. So Debbie, though, was killed, according to the official story, which I don't think there's enough evidence really to go either way. But according to the current story, he was killed at the front, fighting off, or visiting troops who were fighting off at least the fourth major rebellion against his rule. And there's been more than those four, but this is the fourth that was actually driving against the capital to literally depose him. And twice before they got into the capital, in 2006 and 2008, France usually bucks him up, bails him out. In 2019, so not ancient history, they unilaterally bombed the rebel convoy coming south from Libya. The two attacks before that came from the Darfur region of Sudan, which we'll have to talk about at some point. That's where Debbie's own rebellion came from. That's how he took power, from Sudan. But recently they've been coming from Libya again. And so my point in the article was the problem with one-man shows like Debbie is that what happens when he's gone? Because human beings have this pesky habit of dying, either of natural causes or car wrecks or accidents, having, maybe a little bit too much psychedelic drugs and jumping into a swimming pool with no water. There's a lot of ways human beings die, including
what's up with this whole dying thing?
Yeah. So the bottom line is we had no plan. All the eggs were in the Debbie basket, and the whole thing's a mess. And it almost all either stems from or has a major connection to Libya, which of course we broke in 2011.
So let's talk about that a bit, and then I want to get into what Biden said recently in his first address to a joint session of Congress. But first, if we can talk about Libya, provide a brief history of what happened there and how there's still blowback from it today that's not only affecting Africa, but it's affecting Europe as well, with the refugee and migrant crisis, where you have people desperate in literal dinghies trying to make it across the Mediterranean to Europe because they're fleeing these forever wars that the US and its allies supposedly have created.
The Iraq War was a much bigger endeavor in terms of American troops on the ground, in terms of American casualties, in terms of overall casualties, right? Millions. Right, at least more than 1 million might have died, and depending how you count, it could be up to 2 million, 2.2 million. But I'm not saying that Iraq has run its course, the blowback. It's not. It forever altered the greater Middle East. But I think in many ways its worst days, fingers crossed, of that blowback are behind us. Whereas the Libyan blowback, from deciding to remove Gaddafi without much thought of what came next, without even much justification. I mean, not because Gaddafi was a great guy, but because there really was no American interest. There was no national security interest to the American people, at least, of taking this guy out. He'd given up his WMD program in 2003, 4, or 4 or 5 in response to the Iraq War, which was used by people in the Bush administration to say, see, regime change wars work. Even though there was no WMDs in Iraq, it motivated, Reid scared, extorted, mafia style Libya into giving up their very nascent program, which is pretty unsophisticated.
I brought this point up before, sorry to interrupt, but I think it's just important to hammer home again that Gaddafi in 1998, I believe it was the first Arab leader ever to report Osama bin Laden to Interpol. So that's something.
Well, I think the whole taking out of Gaddafi was a Clinton venture, that she needed something to bolster her presidential run. And she thought that this would be a great foreign policy notch on her belt. So that's, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just speculation, but I think that that's a pretty safe bet.
The architects of that, the people at the upper mid-level below people like Hillary Clinton, are now running the Biden foreign policy, or at least are in high positions. So like Jake Sullivan was the guy who in the WikiLeaks, you know, thank you, Julian, again, right?
Yes.
Like we know things we needed to know that we wouldn't have known. But I guess that goes without saying, you know, he was bragging in emails. He was writing up talking points and like running them by everybody, including Secretary Clinton herself, saying, look, we really need to emphasize that you were the energy behind this, behind deciding to do a regime change. The reason I say that the blowback is almost more ongoing or more intense than Iraq is not because the number of deaths is quite as high, but because it really has not even come close to running its course.
Right.
That was proven in the fact that France's number one proxy and one of America's top proxies, if not our own top, you know, was killed by a group that was trained, financed, armed, given transportation, and got battlefield experience to the tune of years as a mercenary outfit, fighting in the civil war in Libya, which has been, you know, kind of ongoing since 2011, right after the regime change, but really has been in this like massive old school American civil war, like divided instead of like the North versus the South, it's the East versus the West. But all that this group, FACT, right, the Chadian Front for Concord and Change or whatever, I mean, that's where they came from, was Libya. And that was where they were able to take root, get their battlefield experience, and again, get money, get guns, get trucks. This is an example of how deep this blowback goes and how twisted the French role is. The American role too, but the thing about the French is that they are just way more invested. They think Africa is what makes them a world power, as we've talked about, like their ability and their ability to project power there, which is higher than anybody but the United States. I mean, the British can't and don't do as much as the French do. Not to say the British are great, but the story with Libya goes back further. And that's not just a geeky historian who likes fact speaking. It matters because Secretary Clinton may have been the energy behind the American decision to bomb and through its bombing, foster the regime change, murder via torture, bayonet sodomy of Gaddafi. I don't think Gaddafi was necessarily an amazing guy. I think that I'm not pro bayonet sodomy. I'm not pro extrajudicial killing, and I'm not pro Islamism taking more root and giving us more justification to fight in Africa, because for all his flaws, this is not an excusal. The guy wasn't about that for the most part.
Right. And in the lead up to his murder, there were stories, totally untrue stories, absurd stories coming out that he was pumping Libyan soldiers full of, what the hell is it called that gives
Viagra.
you boners? Yeah, Viagra,
right.
So that they could go on raping sprees. And it was just total tripe like this, which was used to justify what the US did in Libya.
And that's so important. I mean, there were all the talk of the massacres and the genocide that was coming was inflated. It was inflated opportunistically by the rebels on the ground, many of whom turned out to be pretty serious Islamists who did not like America. I feel like you've seen this movie before, right?
Yeah.
They were freedom fighters before they're terrorists when America supports you.
Well, who can forget the video on the beach at Sirte of the beheadings?
Yeah. And John McCain was visiting at that time, you know, and saying things like, these guys are freedom fighters, right? They're like, I think you compared them to George Washington and the revolutionaries, if I recall.
Well, you mentioned Jake Sullivan earlier. He is quoted on record as saying in public that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side.
That's right.
Yes.
I think that's the exact quote. And it's one of the epigraphs to Max Blumenthal's recent book. And it's just such a flagrant statement of total support for regime change.
And that's how twisted it gets. And I think that France matters here a whole lot, because when you talk about Libya, you talk about Chad, you really are talking about the French sphere. So even though Libya was an Italian colony, the Italians and the Portuguese and the Belgians and the Spanish, for the most part, they don't really keep tabs on their old colonies. The only people that really do are Britain and France. And so they've actually picked up kind of like neo-imperial responsibility that they've pointed themselves to. for a lot of the Belgian and the Italian and Portuguese colonies. And in fact, France has picked up most of it. But that's their stomping grounds. And the backstory here matters because, as I was saying, I think Hillary Clinton may have been in the energy within the Obama administration to do this, but the real energy for it, the most motivated, pushing for it the most, was France. And that may seem silly to some people. Like, that's surprising, right? Aren't the French the guys who throw their hands up whenever the Nazis come in? There's a lot of myth in that too. They fought actually fairly hard before collapsing. A lot of people died in it. France is not this like liberal pacifist society. They're the most overt European imperialists on the map.
Although they were spun that way to us.
Like they do.
They were spun that way to us after 9/11 with Freedom Fries and Jacques Chirac, who is nobody to write home about, but his refusal to get France involved in the war on Iraq.
That was always interesting to me. You know, it was I had taken some almost like a minor in like modern French history when I was at West Point, like as an undergrad, and so I had a more sophisticated view, I think, than most Americans of France, and I thought it was very interesting the way we were spinning them as sort of these like weak-kneed pacifists when it came to intervention, because while Iraq was going on, France was involved in 2 military ventures in Africa. The Ivory Coast, which is like still going on, but was really hot then in like 2002-3. And then the very same month that we did the regime change in Iraq, March of 2003, France, with Chadian military support, did their own sort of regime change in the Central African Republic, which is directly south of Chad. And Chad's had a tortured history there of like its soldiers raping and extrajudicially killing folks enough that they had to actually leave under international scandal. But so that always was interesting to me. But, you know, the French have intervened militarily, like guns blazing, over 50 times in about maybe north of 20 countries in Africa. Nobody does African intervention like the French. So Chad's their area. The French were pushing for this, which may seem strange to an American, but is not strange if you know anything about French history and French African history, modern French African history. France has intervened militarily more times in Chad than anywhere else. And I just said that they've intervened more in Africa than anywhere else. So that lets you know where Chad is. France fought a proxy and legit overt war with Libya over northern Chad. If you look at like the map of Chad, like so many countries, especially in the Middle East, there's a lot of straight lines. And so there's this like literal like straight diagonal line. It's like the Ouzo Strip or Ozu Strip. I'm pronouncing that wrong. It's like Ouzou. And Libya said it's theirs.
The Durand line part 2.
Yeah, right. It really is. And the Italians basically did this. You know, they decided that they were, you know, that they let France have it in some sort of negotiated deal. And then after World War II, when those colonies were kind of like figuring out what we're going to do with the Italian colonies, the UN kind of blessed off on it. So Gaddafi saw himself, whether he was right or wrong, whether he meant it or not, whether he was a hypocrite or not. What is true is that Gaddafi styled himself the Pan-African, the most Pan-African leader, especially North Africa. He actually kind of like proposed having like a massive state, like one big North African Sahel state.
Secular as well.
Yeah, and as an anti-imperialist. So much so that he not only supported with guns and money African rebels, mostly lefties, by the way. This guy was more like lefty than Islamist by a lot, you know, but it's like this kind of like syncretic African nationalism, socialism thing, right? And that's why he funded the IRA. I mean, what does Libya have to do with Northern Ireland? Nothing. It doesn't like imperialists. So that was Gaddafi's shtick, right? And he was kind of brutal at home and he wasn't always great overseas. But because of that, he saw that as a way to kind of like punch France in the nose, make a statement about this total neo-imperial fiction of a state. Like, it did not really have sovereignty. Chad still doesn't really. The governments there serve at the pleasure of the French. If the French don't intervene, they fall in a rebellion, and the next one serves at the pleasure of the French, right? This is how it works in Chad. So he invades like 4 times, Gaddafi does. 3 of those times, he just tries to seize that strip of land, the disputed strip of land, which is basically desert. Half the people there, by the way, want to be Libyan, basically, and half of them basically want to stay Chadian. It's the same old story. So he's got some motive, and then he's also wrong on another account, right? But in the third time, or I'm sorry, the second or third time he intervenes, they actually take the capital. Libyan troops with rebels, right? They're just backing these rebels. So what Libya does is it sends its own troops, thousands of them, into Chad. And it also, more importantly, in some ways, backs these different rebel groups that are opposing the French bolstered regime in the capital, which is much further south. And it's a north-south divide, ethnically, somewhat religiously, culturally, how they make their living, agrarian versus pastoralist.
And is that a result primarily of French colonization, that division? Because we've seen that with other Western powers, with the French actually in Lebanon, for example.
If you look at the French colonies in particular across the Sahel, so starting with Chad, which is the furthest east, and then running it all the way to the west over to, basically Mauritania, right, and Mali and all that stuff. In almost every one of those countries, if you look at the map, what you see is that there are much less straight lines down south. They usually use like rivers or some sort of natural topography to make the boundary with the next colony over. But once it gets up into the Sahel and the Sahara Desert, they're very straight lines, and they were very like fictionally created. In fact, what they ended up doing, the French, is they lumped in all these various ethnic and ethno-linguistic groups that can't even really talk to each other. So, and also different religions. So almost all those countries have the following conditions, some of which the French created, some of which are just based on the level of fertility of the soil, right? And most of the population in all those countries lives in the south, which is more green, basically, more farmable, and has denied social services and given less political voice to the mostly semi-nomadic peoples of the north. And that tension has caused rebellions repeatedly. When you look at the way France carved up the Sahara Desert and the Sahel, it did so legitimately, like like a glass of French wine and like a cigar smoke-filled room, just a bunch of dudes with pencils, and like twirling their handlebar mustaches.
Not legally, legitimately, but
yeah, right.
They really were sitting in a parlor and deciding the fate of millions of people with whom they have no connection whatsoever.
And generally the French had the most trouble because of distance, right? Transportation was difficult back then. They didn't really have, they had to build railroads. The north of these countries, where the Tuaregs live in the Western Sahel, where the Tubu people live in northern Chad, they were the last ones to get conquered. They held out longer because it's hard to like move an army into the desert. They, as semi-nomadic peoples, mountain people and semi-nomadic arid people who live in arid areas, I mean, just a broad brush, tend to be the hardest to take down, and they tend to be the most fierce and warlike. I think it's partly because maybe they're a little less fixed to the ground, right? A little fixed to the land. And so that's a whole other discussion. But France would send these like razas or whatever, these like raids. They were like adventures of like a small number of French soldiers with a whole large group of differently ethnic, differently linguistic, Southern, and also usually blacker, right, in terms of skin color. There's a racial sort of ethnic divide there. Soldiers that were their proxies, and they would go into the north of these countries, and they would commit mass murder. And this went on from 1900 or so until, in some cases, the French really don't get full control of those northern areas, whether it's in Chad or in Mali or wherever, until well into the 1930s and 40s. The legacy of that is with us. So these peoples are fiercely anti-imperialist, fiercely anti-French, but they're also anti their own southern populations, which they see as denying them the wealth of the country, which they are, denying them social services, which they are, denying them proper political representation, which they are, and also being collaborators. They see them as collaborators because they did. I mean, they were the first ones to get conquered, and they a lot of them would work with the French to make a bunch of money. So that's kind of the story of the French involvement. But the thing is, why would France want to get rid of Gaddafi? Because they held a grudge. I mean, there's more to it than that.
I wanted to, sorry again to interrupt, but
Please.
Just going on that topic, I wanted to perhaps bring up the Berlin discotheque bombing, and then also Pan Am Flight 103, as far as grudges against Gaddafi go. And also Reagan's bombing of Libya and the killing of Gaddafi's adopted daughter, I believe.
So Reagan, the French have always had like kind of a hatred for Gaddafi, right? Because French soldiers died in that desert, right? Fighting against Gaddafi. The Americans were involved. We provided enormous amounts of support, military and otherwise, to the Chadian army of the way more brutal than Deby predecessor, which was Hassan Habre, has been called the biggest African mass murderer, of the modern era. Ordered the killing of about 40,000 of his own people, right? Which, so if you don't count Rwanda, which was, I think, a little bit more of a shared blame, although the French were in on that one too, whole other story. But this is a bad guy who is now in prison because he's a convicted ICC war criminal for those 40,000 extrajudicial killings, and he's a sexual slaver, convicted one. That ain't great. I feel like you really have to go around the neighborhood, like child molesters do, but maybe even worse. You got to be like, hey, listen, I know you've got kids. By law, I have to tell you I'm a sexual slaver. That's a thing. That's what he's convicted of. So that's who he was. French and Americans loved him. He was very useful.
Of course they did. Those were our people.
Reagan, his ambassador to Chad for like 4 or 5 years, has said, and I think I quoted in the article, like Reagan's got a thing about Gaddafi. And what he meant was Reagan was obsessed with him. He was kind of the Saddam of the era. He was pointed to like he was like the new Hitler in this like petty war over northern Chad where like nobody lives, or at least like there are real people who matter, but like small populations, right? Not dense. So he authorized a secret CIA program, much of which is still classified, really, now. But what we know is they give a whole bunch of Toyota Hilux trucks to the pro-Chad government forces, including like the paramilitaries. They gave a lot of guns. They trained on a lot of anti-tank missiles, and they were doing, we don't even really know all that they were doing, but it was a typical CIA operation with a lot of blowback. This was in support of the French. Well, Gaddafi, he was maybe, or to some extent, definitely sponsoring either what you would call terrorists, but definitely he was sponsoring rebellions, left-wing rebellions in Europe, although a lot of it was kind of like lied and dissembled about and exaggerated. But nevertheless, Gaddafi would admit that, he was trying to support anti-imperial endeavors all over. In response to the Berlin discotheque bombing in 86, Reagan orders a very, very large bombing operation. It all unfolded in like an hour or so, like the actual bombing. We're talking like 110 planes, bombers. Dozens of Libyan civilians were killed, including, there's some dispute about whether this is true or not. But it likely killed his adopted infant daughter. This was happening, though. Most people looked at it even then. I've read the old articles, like from the New York Times in 86. It's generally reported as like a unilateral American endeavor, but what's rarely reported was the CIA operation that was ongoing at the time. Of course, a lot of that was classified even more then, but also France was in a shooting war with Libya at that time in the Northern Desert. And that's called the Toyota War. It was the last phase. It was like 84 to 87. It was before they finally pushed the Libyans out.
Is that spelled like the car?
It is spelled like the car because it's named after the car. And I don't know if I've said this in the show, but I've said it a few times.
The trucks.
I think that Toyota should put this in their commercials. I mean, if you're going to sell cars that are destroying the environment, I mean, I drive an automobile as well, but like, because I'm a hypocrite, because I'm human. But what I'm saying is, like, wouldn't it be great to be like, hey, how many of our competitors have a war in Africa named after them? But it's called the Toyota War. If you Google it, that's what it was nicknamed. And it was because
the Toyota Cressida,
these Toyota Hiluxes that were largely CIA provided were just like tooling around with big like RPKs and Dishkas on the back and like fighting it out. And, that was like the most intense phase of that war. So the point is, none of this happened in a vacuum. America's bombing of Libya, which may have been technically motivated by response to alleged bombings sponsored by Libya and Europe, was very much a big time assist to the ongoing like French proxy, and then at that point kind of shooting war in northern Chad. When you know all that, it makes it a little more understandable, why France would have pushed so hard to get rid of Gaddafi when they felt they had a shot. And by get rid of them, they mean use America to get rid of them, because they couldn't do it themselves. They ran out of bombs after a month. They had to be emergency resupplied by the American military industrial complex or by the on-hand stock of the Pentagon. These guys write checks.
That sounds familiar, running out of bombs.
They write checks that they can't cash, right? Too big, right? Their stomachs are like, aren't as big as their, eyes or whatever, that kind of whole thing. And so they figure, but you know what, Uncle Sam will back us up. And it also makes it more clear why these Front for Concord and Change in Chad rebels might have come from Libya, which is to say that what's old is new. And past this prologue, and this is not the first time that Libya has been the staging ground for the takeover or the attempt to take over of a government in Chad. The American regime change only made that almost easier and sort of accelerated it because of, like this just madness up in Libya. And war economies produce mercenaries, they produce proxy wars, and they produce spillover into other countries, which of course we saw in Mali in 2013 when the Tuareg Legion, the Arab Legion of the Desert Legion of Gaddafi, they went home. These Sahelian Tuaregs who had fought for him because he spoke their language and said, I want a Tuareg state, like a Kurdish state, because it spans like 5 or 6 different countries, the Tuareg population. That was the first blowback, but now we're seeing it again. The last point on this, though, is that it's really messed up because France is like, they've been twisting imperial webs longer than even we have. And we've been doing it for a moment. But they really got caught in their own this time because the guy they back illegally, breaking international arms embargoes, they're not the only ones, but this is a NATO country, breaking international arms embargoes to provide weapons, special forces trainers and advisors with anti-tank weapons, mercenaries in some cases, and a bunch of money and diplomatic support to Khalifa Haftar, who is a former Libyan general turned wannabe warlord who owns basically the east of Libya and is trying to take over the government that's internationally recognized. That government, of course, being flawed because the whole place is a mess after we broke it. France backs Haftar, and Haftar's the guy that they fought for, these rebels, that they got their battle experience with. He probably gave them the trucks, reporting says, and they were stationed at an airfield for like at the end of their tenure there, at least the last year. They were stationed on this important airfield in Libya, which just so happened to be also the headquarters for the Russian Wagner Group, which reportedly may have trained them in like techniques of like rebellion and insurgency. So you got a Russian private military outfit in Libya supporting Haftar. Why? Because Putin supports Haftar. What a weird world. We've got a NATO country, France, which is on the same side as Russia in Libya. And then we've got another NATO country. So France has the 3rd largest army in NATO. Turkey has the 2nd largest. Turkey backs the GNA, the Government and National Accord, which is kind of messy and a little bit Islamist inflected, but it is the internationally recognized government in Tripoli, which controls Western Libya. So you've got 2 NATO countries basically fighting a proxy war with each other. And oh, by the way, it's not like it's the Netherlands and Portugal. Nothing against those countries, but in terms of military might, we're talking about the 2nd and 3rd largest armies in NATO. So this is the blowback.
nuclear armed
in the case of France, and then nuclear missiles stationed there at Incirlik Air Base in the case of Turkey, American nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack there, but
Yeah.
I know there's so much.
I wanted to.
My brain's a little fried already today.
Since we were just talking about Reagan, and I'd also like to talk about Pan Am Flight 103 because I think it was as they say, watershed moment. And it's also personal to me in a way because one of my neighbors when I was growing up, he was 21, he was on that plane and he died in that bombing. So there's that aspect of it. But more to the point of our conversation is that I think that's really when Libya started to be almost fully demonized by the West and especially the US. And still today, Libya is blamed for that bombing. Remember, Gaddafi was pretty much put under duress to admit that it was probably a Libyan or Libyan operatives who bombed Pan Am Flight 103. And I think that's why it was a watershed moment, because then it was like all the gloves are coming off and we're gonna get Libya back somehow. And there's not that much concrete proof that Libya was behind the bombing. In fact, I've talked to people who have suggested that it was Iran after the US shot down the Iranian civilian airliner earlier that year. So I think that bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, which was in 1988,
That's right.
was sort of what put Reagan and then shortly afterward Bush Sr. over the edge with regard to Gaddafi, and then that led to what we see today. But I want to read this paragraph from your piece. Also, lest we forget, President Reagan supplemented the earlier French efforts in Chad with a retaliatory bombing for Gaddafi's alleged sponsorship of terrorist attacks on US troops stationed in Europe, of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1986, which killed dozens of civilians, possibly including the Libya leader's adopted infant daughter. Approximately 100 US Air Force and Navy aircraft were involved in the massive, in brief, Operation El Dorado Canyon. One F-111 bomber was even shot down, killing 2 American captains. Reagan, who was described by his ambassador to Chad, John Blaine, as having, quote, a thing, unquote, about Gaddafi, tapped the CIA to wage a covert war against the Libyans in the country. So you explained that to us, but I think that paragraph hammers it down even more. And it's like not even reality. It's realpolitik for sure, but
the breeziness with which Reagan and so many other people then before and since will unleash the CIA on these are big programs. You know, it's not just a couple of agents. And even if it is a small number of agents on the ground, you can start a shitstorm with an agency like the CIA, because what you do is you get people to fight for you and they're locals. But a lot of people have died behind that stuff, as we know. I mean, geez, look at Indonesia, which is like a near genocide, right? I mean, we're talking like mass murder at the scale of 1 million, 500,000 at least. And, you know, the just like they're flip about it. They're just like, well, Gaddafi bad, let's unleash this thing. This is happening at the same time as we're doing the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. This was a time of, the 80s are one of like the golden ages of CIA meddling to the tune of mass murder, because there's really 3 areas the CIA is like game the, you know what, on, right? Like in Afghanistan, they are paying bounties for Russian heads. Like we made up a story about that and then repeated it uncorroborated because Putin bad, right? But we did that. Like we may not have like had them bring us the heads or anything. You know, it wasn't like the way the Spanish handled like the Apache and the Comanche, like literally, but we were paying them to kill Russians. And we have major national security figures like Brzezinski, right? The national security advisor saying, we're going to make this their Vietnam. And we don't care if like the Taliban came out of it. What's that compared to taking down an empire like the Soviets? So we were bragging about it. Yeah. Movies like Rambo 3 were getting made, bragging about it, dedicated at the end. They got rid of that on the newer releases, but at the end, that's saying like dedicated to the brave Mujahideen freedom fighters of Afghanistan. Well, like a lot of those guys became Taliban or warlords, mass murderers after they kicked the Soviets out. So that's happening.
Yeah, I think they changed it to the brave men and women of Afghanistan.
Right. Yeah.
Which is,
the propaganda is so fun, you guys.
That encompasses whom?
Yeah. Right? So then they were, and then they're in Chad. That one's the most forgotten, I think, but a lot of people die behind that. And we were on the side of sexual slaver. I just want to be clear about that, right? I just think we need to keep saying that, and mass murderer. But, you know, there's a lot of mass murderers. Something about being convicted as a sexual slaver is, I just think that's fascinating. And that's who America liked. That was our guy in that part of Africa. And then in Central America at the same time. This is all simultaneous, right? So you take a year like 86 to 88, like we're describing. The discotheque bombing and the bombing of Tripoli is 86. The Lockerbie is 88. Between 86 and 88, that's the climax, essentially, of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. That's when bin Laden's there, right? Sort of vaguely on the same team as Americans at the very least, right? We're in Chad.
The Stinger missiles are going wild.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was anti-tank missiles and stuff going to Chad. And then we're supporting the CIA's running the Contras, as well as backing the military right-wing, like basically like fascist state in El Salvador. So if you combine the 3,
And then briefly in Lebanon in the early 80s until the Marine barracks was bombed.
In the 80s, Reagan, and I've written about this, and it's been misread as like an endorsement of Reagan. What I'm trying to say
And
is that, like,
I should say, because we're talking about France a lot here, the French embassy in Lebanon was bombed at almost exactly the same time that the Marine barracks was bombed.
minutes, I think, right? It was like basically minutes.
Yeah. Robert
The
Fisk
French, of course, have
has,
always had like a tie to Lebanon. They were the protectors of like the Christians there. So
yeah.
basically, the 80s were not a lot of American soldiers died in the 80s because Reagan was like a little more careful than he had a lot of bombast, but he was careful about getting American soldiers killed because in the wake of Vietnam, that whole Vietnam syndrome was strong. So with the exception of the Marine bombing, not that many soldiers died under Reagan's watch. You know, some of them died in that like farce of the Grenada invasion, but not much of that. But the real energy behind American indecency in the 80s was the agency, was the CIA. And so in Central America, of course, where the body count from the Contras is probably around 90,000. That's like a pretty reasonable estimate. In Chad, we know at least 40,000. And then in Afghanistan, I don't think we even count there how many people the Mujahideen killed either during or before. Now, some of them were occupying Russians, but some of them were not, right? Some of them were women who wanted to go to school, and some of them were communists, like political activists who were giving land to those who till it for the first time in Afghan history, and like overthrowing, this like feudalism. I mean, the communists tend to do good things and bad things, right? Not just bad guys. So
I mean, we should mention too that Saudi Arabia matched the U.S. dollar for dollar in its operation against the Mujahideen.
Wouldn't you know that Chad? No one knows this. Wouldn't you know that Chad, like officially, is part of under Debbie? I guess technically still is. Chad, even though they haven't provided like a whole lot of overt support, although there are reports of Chadian fighters on the Saudi and UAE side. There are way more Sudanese mercenaries though. Chad is officially part of that coalition of the willing and wretched, which is what we should call it, that the Saudis are leading in Yemen. So Chad, not unlike the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, was obviously backed by the French, backed by the Americans, but with a hefty assist in terms of where the actual money comes from the oil drunk monsters who behead women for sorcery and witchcraft in Saudi Arabia. Chad's part of that coalition.
Crimes on earth.
It's dirty. It's a dirty world.
I was just saying crimes on earth as Khomeini's government, or whatever you want to call it, when he was in power, when he was alive, put it. People were sentenced to death for crimes on earth, which is very specific.
Right. The Libya Chad angle is one of those. I'm a geek, and so I love thinking that I've got like my finger on it, and sometimes I'm right, and sometimes maybe I make too much of a certain issue because I get obsessed with it. I recognize that in myself. I will say that this backstory on Chad's war in the 80s and the Libyan connection ever since in Chad, I think this is one of the stories that's not covered either at all, enough, or well, and not just for the sake of knowledge, but for its ramifications. Because as I've been saying, and we've talked about Africa like almost every time I've been on for the last few times, with good reason, this is the new battleground. This Africa thing is gonna matter. And whether you're a human rights person, you should care, because a lot of obscene murder and mass rape as a tool of war is going on in Africa. And you show me where that's happening, and I got to tell you, 7 out of 10 times, the perpetrators, especially if they're states, they're U.S. or French backed, not the other way around. So we keep hearing about, this is what's interesting to me, among a million things. Interesting, I mean grotesque. The United States has now said the reason AFRICOM needs to exist is not the terrorists anymore. Like, we got to keep fighting them, but that's our number 2 priority. Literally, number 2. Now, they've changed their prioritization. I've read the documents. Like, don't do it. Don't do it. Don't stay up doing that. Like, you'll be worse off for it. Like, everyone should, but you will personally be unhappy. Like, make an appointment with your therapist. I've read it. They've changed the prioritization away from like fighting Islamism. So that's not the reason anymore. It's to counter Russian and Chinese, this is my favorite phrase that the intelligence community is obsessed with now, and the Pentagon, nefarious activities. Anything Russia or China does is nefarious. They love that word, or you know what their second one is? Malign. They like malign.
Malign.
And I think the reason is because malign works in an alliteratory way with Moscow. You know what I mean? So Moscow's malign. I think it sounds good.
It also insinuates cancer as well.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. And we talk about language all the time, and the choice of words is very intentional. They're very good at figuring out what words will solicit a emotional reaction from people, and especially regarding Russia. I mean, China is becoming more of the issue now, but Russia is, you know, that's been ingrained in us since, you know, the Cold War. So they're very good at, you know, trying to find those emotional words to bring up. The rhetoric is, I mean, and you're right. Like, we are the biggest purveyors of all of the, you know, nefarious and malignant stuff across the globe. But it's the whole Machiavellian thing. Accuse others of doing that which you are doing. And nobody does that better than the United States and its allies.
We've lost all of our moral high ground, if we ever had any. I mean, like I said in the previous article, where the American exceptionalists are like vampires, you know, because I know vampire movies are in, or maybe I'm outdated on that, but you know, I'm always behind. But they can't see their own reflection in the mirror is the point I was trying to make. I thought I was being.
They're always in.
Yeah, they can't see their reflection. There's a lack of self-awareness. We don't understand why the world thinks we're hypocritical. That's clinical narcissism at that point. But like, let's just indulge me for a few minutes. Like, let me go west to east from the west coast of African Sahel to the Horn of Africa. And for all the talk of all the nefarious activities, malign activities of China and Russia, let's remember that America has dozens of bases, thousands of troops. France has more than us in Africa. China has one so far with a plan to build another. Russia has kind of one military base, I mean. No like brigades, like no like legit combat forces on the thing. And yeah, they send mercenaries. The Wagner Group's been active in Mozambique and is currently, I think, still active in Libya. But like, America does all that in spades, but like when we do it, it's not malign. So let's use that malign word. Moscow's malign behavior, Beijing's malign behavior, right? We'll call it maybe Mandarin malign. We got to stick with the alliteration, right? So here's the point. I'm just going to describe, like, in 1 or 2 sentences, what's something that's happening that America is doing in a country going across the band. And I want, as a thought experiment, for everyone to wonder, listeners, like, and I know your listeners probably already agree, but I think this is important. I've never really done it. How would it read? How would we cover it if Moscow did it, or Beijing? So we'll start with Mali. Imagine if Moscow had provided massive military aid to democratic election rigging governments between 2012 and today, 2 different governments, both of which came to power in a military coup. Both of the coup leaders were trained by the Russian army, right? I mean, this is America, of course, but like, imagine, right? And then we continue to support them in violation of our own amendments, like our own laws, the Leahy law, saying we can't support people who, you know, violate human rights. We can't provide military aid to them. What if Moscow did that? Okay, let's continue to move east, right? So what if, you know, Moscow had backed a strongman for 31 years who was the chief of staff of the army under the sexual slaver, 40,000 person mass murderer, took power in his own military coup, which was supported by Moscow, and then was kept in power for 30 years, even after he changed the constitution 3 different times, rigging elections in each case so that he could stay in power forever, had his opponents killed in many cases, including in one case, one of the opposition leaders' mothers, this happened this year, mother and child, and also was conscripting child soldiers. And then let's say Moscow changed its own laws or waived its own laws so you can keep giving aid to the child soldier factory that was Chad. Imagine that. Now, I mean, if you keep going across the continent, you can see that in almost every case, whatever the role we're saying that is so malign about Moscow, they're doing way less of that than we are. And I just think thought experiments are important. I mean, it's a walk in other people's shoes thing, but I don't even think we're capable of that anymore. Part of it is these people grew up in the 70s and the 80s, the people in power. So like you said, Misty, I think like it's so ingrained It's Red Dawn, it's Top Gun, it's all that anti-Russian Hunt for Red October, whatever. They grew up in that. They associate the Soviet Union with the Russians, and now they hate Trump a whole lot, or hated Trump a whole lot. And so now you have to hate the Russians even more, because to hate Russia is to hate Trump, and to hate Trump is to hate Russia. And we've just linked those things in our mind without really looking at what are these countries doing in Africa that's so much different than what we are. 7 African coups, military coups, since the founding of AFRICOM have been led by U.S. trained or advised military leaders. Full stop. I mean, shut AFRICOM down at that point. I mean, that sounds extreme, but I just think, when is it too much? When is it too much? It's twice in Mali. This August, a U.S. trained captain took over the government in a coup. Coups are not okay, but they are okay if it's our coup.
Right.
The thing is, like, FDR said about like a South American leader, he may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch.
Yeah.
Now we don't even say he's a son of a bitch anymore.
I think that was also said about Somoza, wasn't it?
And he may and well have been speaking about Somoza, because that was like around the same time, right? We're talking about like the Somoza government in Nicaragua, versus Sandino. Yeah. I mean, he definitely said that. Now we don't even say they're bastards anymore, because we're afraid to. Because if you say he's our son of a bitch, that implies he probably is doing some kid killing and, maybe some mass raping. The Leahy laws would require, since 1999, when they were first put in place, 98, 99, that you can't provide military aid. So what we do now is bureaucratic sort of sleight of hand. And one of the ways we do this, and this is Nick Terce's work, this is super important. We're on a tangent, but like, this is it. This is a story.
Yeah, and just for anybody who doesn't know Nick Terce, he's done some excellent work on AFRICOM for years, and what the Western Imperial adventures, if you will, have been there. So definitely check him out. I don't know if he's still with The Intercept, but regardless,
he shouldn't be.
Yeah,
he writes there, but he writes a lot of places too. Yeah, Tom Dispatch.
Right. Yeah, regardless of that, his work is solid, and he did a piece a few years ago on Cameroon, which hopefully we can talk about in an episode. But it showed a video, an execution video of a mother and her infant child, and you actually see them both get shot to death by Cameroonian. It's hard to tell if they're military or mercenaries, but apparently the video is from 2015. Mm-hmm. And somebody in the comments tried to downplay it by saying it was from 2015. Like, that makes a difference. It's still an act of murder, of even genocidal murder, you could say, if there's ethnicity involved, if there's ethnic cleansing involved. But anyway, long story short, check out Nick Terce's work if you haven't, because it's really good on what we're talking about here today. And educate yourself, because as Danny's been saying, Africa is the next front. It's already a front, but it's already a front. It's going to be the next big one.
Not talked about.
Yeah. I think that something to keep an eye on, that I always kind of like go this way, like towards the end or whatever. Like, one of the things that Nick does is he's kind of like the squeaky wheel, canary in the coal mine, just like exasperating voice. Like, AFRICOM knows him well. Like, he is not welcome at their headquarters. He's ignored when he calls, and when he emails, they literally hate him. Like, he writes about those recordings.
Did you hear those recordings he made when he called AFRICOM and tried to ask a simple question, and they just kept shutting him down or hanging up on him?
I'm picturing like that Crank Yankers prank call where Tracy Morgan acts like he calls as he's like himself. He sounds like stereotypically like he's almost like playing up like an African American sort of like slang, and the country club won't let him get a tea time, and then he has to call back and he says, "This is Richard Simmons," and I'd like it, and then they're like amenable, and he's like, "Aha, I got your ass!" Like, it's one of my favorite Crank Yankers, right? Like, yeah. I think that's what Nick Terce is gonna have to start doing. He's probably already tried it, or he's gonna like show up to the headquarters like, and they're going to kick him out, and then he's going to come back in like a cartoonishly bad like glasses and mustache that you buy like in the thrift store. But one of the things that he does so well is he digs deep into not just the individual countries, but the programs that allow it. And this is boring stuff to most people, but I think he writes it well, but it's not covered a whole lot in the mainstream. If you really want to understand something, you have to understand the language, like we always talk about. You have to understand the way that they use like bureaucratic tools to continue to back these regimes. So he talks about like U.S. Special Operations Command and how they've grown, because they're the ones doing it. It's the Green Berets mainly, and the Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, but like it's the Green Berets because their primary mission is FID, foreign internal defense, which means backing governments we like against the internal insurgencies, and then also like unconventional warfare, UW, which is when they back the insurgency. So the special forces, like the CIA, has two main roles.
Foreign internal defense.
Yeah, nice word, FID.
For fuck's
so my
sake.
buddies, my best friend was a Green Beret, right? And we would debate like what Green Berets should be doing. And he's a skeptical and interesting guy and critical eye, but we would this debate, like, should they be focusing on direct action, which is what they started doing after 9/11? Like, that's not their main role. That's supposed to be like their tertiary role, to like do raids. That's more like the Rangers and the SEALs. The Green Berets, which is the majority really of the on the ground killers and actual fighters, combat soldiers and special operations community, they do FID or UW. Those are supposed to be their 1-2, and I'm not sure of the order. That's what they call it, but they're the guys doing it. So like, just one of the things he mentions is that in 2001, special operations, you have to ask how special they are anymore to a certain extent. They were, topping out at about $3.1 billion in funding. It's 13.1 as of like last year. So that's what, 4 times more than 4 times. There were 40,000 special operations forces, meaning anybody who falls under the umbrella. It's not just like the Navy SEAL types and the Green Beret types, but like their support personnel, but people who work for SOCOM or, that was 43,000. Now there's 74,000. Around the time of 9/11, there'd be about 2,900 special forces guys overseas doing one thing or another, training folks or, actually engaged in combat. And now that's double. They also are taking all the casualties now because we don't have combat brigades doing a lot of fighting anymore, at least since 2014 with the drawdown in Afghanistan. So they're about 3% of the force, 40% of the casualties in the U.S. military. But what they do is, with the support of the CIA, because they work in close tandem, what they do is they come up with these mechanisms to avoid the Leahy Law. Just a couple to go through before I run out of time. Like Section 1202 authority, right, of the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act is something to keep an eye on. What it says, okay.
Sorry, can you repeat that number one more time?
Yeah. So we're talking about Section 1202.
Okay.
Authority. So they call it Section 1202 authority, which is something that was granted basically for the first time in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, which is the one that changed America's overall priorities, not just AFRICOM, from fighting the war on terror to great power competition, they call it, or GPC. People who are still in the military will throw that a word around. Oh, we're doing GPC ops now. Just means like proxy battling with Russia and China, and maybe eventually really battling. So what that says is quote, this is what they say it is defined as. The 1202 authority is used to provide support to foreign forces, irregular forces, groups, or individuals taking part in irregular warfare, specifically, here's the word, as Mark Esper said it, against non-terrorist threats. Non-terrorist threats. This is the key, comma, including malign state actors. Now, he does not necessarily name who the state actors are, but I love language and I love the transitive property. So if you look at every single Pentagon or intelligence or National Security Council assessment, right, official ones, the big ones, they always describe what Russia and China do. Specifically, they get that designation of malign. So you know what they're talking about, right? That's who we're fighting. So they use this in Africa. And what it does is it allows us to do, quote, to fight fire with fire through, quote, proactive, dynamic, and unorthodox approaches to irregular warfare that can shape, prevent, and prevail against our nation's adversaries. So what it means essentially is use local forces to do sabotage and anything to overthrow folks, the influence of folks we don't like or governments backed by them. Now, I think the
use of unorthodox is striking.
That is.
because special forces are supposed to be unorthodox. That's why that mission is called UW, unconventional warfare. So if you're doing unorthodox unconventional warfare, you're either doing an inversion, now it's just orthodox, or it means like really off the rails, which is what it means.
Right.
But the thing that's interesting about it is they use authorities like 1202 to avoid the oversight of Congress. There are loopholes essentially, and there's another one, for example, which I'm almost done here, but I think this matters, and I'm just pulling up. Okay, so U.S. Code Title 10 127 Echo, that's what the military calls it. They just call it the 127 Echo, allows special operations forces to use local troops to do America's bidding, right? And according to the Joint Staff's Vice Director for Operations, Major General James Hecker, it, quote, that 127 Echo authority, which is what lets the Green Berets like make the decision or get authority to back these proxies. They don't have to be government forces. They can also be like paramilitaries or ethnic militias that happen to be aligned with us. And so we can't send a brigade to Africa because that might cause a political shitstorm right now. But what we can do is let our special forces create warlords. Now, we didn't learn that lesson in Syria. Heck, we didn't learn that lesson in Iraq. We didn't learn that lesson in Afghanistan, where the government still has ex-warlords in it and current warlords. But 127 Echo, quote, according to this guy in the Joint Staff, provides us viable surrogate forces designed to achieve U.S. objectives at relatively low cost in terms of resources and especially risk to our personnel. To translate that from the bureaucratic Pentagonese, he's saying this is really useful to us to use these proxies to do the killing, because it doesn't actually cost us that much, because like they work for like $2 an hour, no bathroom breaks. And also it doesn't get a lot of our people killed, which means there's no political risk because there won't be public attention because Americans aren't dying, which means we can do the unorthodox unconventional that is allowed in that 1202. So it all links. But the thing about 127 Echo is that it has basically been able to be a blind spot or a loophole. So for example, when asked whether 127 Echo surrogates, those forces that we're using, underwent any type of screening, Africa Command told Nick to go to the State Department. In other words, are they being screened by law for the Leahy Law? In other words, what the Leahy Law says is that every time we're going to give money or training to a local security force of any sort, that does not just mean the Army, we have to do basically an assessment, has to be done like in the State Department and the Pentagon to determine, it's supposed to be objectively, it never is, whether they are, in the quote, the language in the Leahy Law is actually, it's pretty open. It's not that strict. In other words, credible accusations of human rights abuses. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't mean convicted in the ICC. If there's even credible evidence that they're doing this, you're not allowed to give money to them. But 127 Echo surrogates, he said, wait, do they have to get looked at? Because it's a secret program, right? Most of this is clandestine. Mm-hmm. So the State Department, so Africa Command said, go to the State Department and ask them. We don't know. You don't know whether you're breaking U.S. code. And then what did the State Department say? Go ask AFRICOM.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, a lot of on sort of background national security officials have said that 127 Echo specifically is designed to avoid the oversight. And JSET operations, which is like what we're doing in Mozambique, we talked about last time, sending that like special forces team over there to do it. For example, just last quote on this. This was in the Washington Post even in 1998. Okay, so this is a long story. The JSETs,
that's before democracy died in darkness.
Yeah, I mean, even Dana Priest, she gets this right. It's when the Green Berets go and train people, right? She said that the program is one in which effective civilian oversight and coordination with the State Department is minimal to non-existent. And what we found out since then is that these JSETs, right, the JCETs, the Green Berets training local forces, mm-hmm. They don't necessarily go on like get overviewed, or they don't get assessed for Leahy Law violations. All of this is to say that we have come up with bureaucraties, sleight of hands, and trickery to continue to support monsters in Africa. And the reason I write about Deby is because Deby is kind of the extreme. He's the guy who goes to the front because there's always rebellions against him and literally farms out his child soldiers to fight for France and America. Like, he's an extreme example, and he was in power for 31 years. But really, his story is the story of Franco-American operations in Africa. If Moscow did it, it would be massive news. They would have to come up with a new word. Is there a worse word than malign? Malign would no longer hold. We need another M word for alliteration that's worse. Monstrous. What would we start saying in our intel? But we do it as a matter of course. Routinely, we do it, and Russia does way less of it. And if they did it, it wouldn't be okay. I'm just saying we do more. Doesn't make it okay when they do. We do way more. And then the difference is we lie about it and hide it. We make it look polite.
And then when it comes out, there's just a bevy of cheap attempts at moral equivalence.
Yes. We're spreading democracy, guys. Didn't you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, but Putin's poisoning
With
like
a
a
capital
handful
D.
of people, maybe. So I mean, like, here's a question: has Putin poisoned as many people as America has trained that took over countries in military coups? Like, I don't know. What's the accusation? Like, I'm not saying that makes. And let's say Putin did those things, right? Like exactly the way you said. It wouldn't be okay. This is not like a dissembling or moral equivalency. I just think I do think scale matters.
Yes.
Yeah. But,
I mean, Putin hasn't even poisoned as many people as have been poisoned in the city of Flint, you know?
But
I'm just saying.
I'll say one thing about the whole poisoning rigmarole is that my father's Ukrainian, and after the Soviet Union fell, he went to Ukraine to try to start businesses there that would actually help Ukrainians who were trying to figure out what to do after the Soviet Union fell and capitalism was starting to infest their lives. And he told me that, and this is from his experience in Ukraine and also Russia. He's been to Russia a lot. Yes, Putin is a very powerful man, but he's not calling all the shots. An oligarch can make a decision to poison or shoot somebody in the head as they leave their house for work in the morning, just as simply as Putin could order it. And that's what gets lost in the narrative as well, that it's not just like Putin doesn't control Russia. It's not like people wake up in the morning and they go out to the street and they prostrate themselves to Putin and utter his name over and over. It's not like that. And people don't pay attention to the amount of oligarchs that are in Russia, how wealthy they are, and the power they wield. I mean, it's comparable in some cases to the power that Putin wields, I would argue.
I think this is important. America has created the Putin myth as like 10 feet tall. We do this a lot, right? If you call somebody the new Hitler and the new monster and the new everything, I mean, when you put them on special terrorist watch lists and stuff and like designate them as, we call them literally SDTs, right? Especially designated terrorists, the State Department. You create the myth, right? And when the myth becomes truth, print the myth, right? Like the whole man who shot Liberty Valance thing. We've created a 10-foot tall Putin and a 100-foot tall Russia that just isn't there. I mean, it just isn't there in terms of power. Of course, he'll take it to a certain extent, right? Like he makes us look stupid every time. I mean, the guy is like, what is it that he does? What's the martial art that he does? It's I know it's the one where like you partly use the other person's aggression against
judo.
Yeah, like I think he does judo. Like he does that like both in terms of geopolitics, but also linguistically when he like parries with like Biden or Trump or whomever, like usually it's a Democrat, but like whoever, he makes us look dumb. Like it doesn't mean you have to like the guy per se, but like, man, he's savvy. And so we build him up. We build up his level of control. Take the Wagner Group. South African and Rhodesian ex-apartheid soldiers are in Mozambique, right? Or may have just left. Credibly accused by various human rights organizations, official reports of murdering people, dropping grenades out of helicopters. Look at this last time. There are also ex-apartheid soldiers led by ex-apartheid Rhodesian colonels. And there are tons of them around Africa. You show me a South African mercenary, a white South African mercenary, and I'll show you that he is fighting on the side of the American-backed government or the American preferred government 9 out of 10 times. And there's way more of them than there are Wagner Group guys. Minimal reporting about that. Why? America likes apartheid. We supported it. We kind of are apartheid, right? And our favorite apartheid state is bombing Gaza now, you know. Yeah. But the thing is, Wagner Group gets all the attention because the implication is that because there may be some financial ties with some of the oligarchs that are tied to him, that like somehow the Wagner Group is just an extension of the Kremlin. It's not that simple at all. Also, why does everyone scream about the Wagner Group? Because they're active in 2 main areas. I mean, there are a bunch of places, but the 2 big areas in Africa, we're upset with them. They back Haftar in Libya, and they backed the government in Mozambique, which is odd because in Mozambique, they were on the side of the government we also want to win. Mm-hmm. In both cases, and kind of in Syria to a certain extent, that's the other big area, they've been like run out of Dodge. Like in Libya, they took dozens and dozens of casualties. They took several to maybe over a dozen, maybe about 20 in Mozambique. They got kicked out of northern Mozambique and retreated with their tail between their legs. Now, here's the thing. If you really hate Russia and you really hate Russians and enough that you may, like, let's say, want them to die and maybe you used to put bounties on their head in Afghanistan, then why are we so worried about the Wagner Group running around Africa getting its butt kicked a lot? It's a messy place. I just think it's interesting because what it shows is this idea that if Blackwater does something, right, or its successor organizations, like Eric Prince tried to run arms and on armored vehicles that were supposed to go to Jordan to Haftar, who also Russia backs, and France. We kind of don't, not really, in Libya. This is like a scandal. There's been some pretty good reporting on it. Gray Zone's done some stuff on it. The Intercept has, admittedly. You ever notice that when he does that, or when Blackwater was just like shooting up civilians in like Baghdad when I was there and causing all that blowback, nobody ever said.
Nisour Square.
Like, yeah, no one ever said like, oh, Blackwater said it's just an extension of the American government. Well, Eric Prince, that's American policy.
Jeremy Scahill, for all his faults nowadays, has done some excellent reporting on that.
Oh yeah, huge, great. He was, especially at the time. But the point is, I think we assume, look, it's not that the U.S. government didn't hire them to do security for their State Farm people. It's not that sometimes we don't definitely use mercenaries as an extension of our government power. But anybody who thinks that Blackwater or its successor and similar organizations is just a direct extension of the White House, the way we say the Wagner Group is of the Kremlin, that person doesn't understand how the world works, how government power works.
And for fuck's sake, Eric Prince's sister, it was Kellyanne Conway, right?
No, his sister is Betsy DeVos.
Betsy
DeVos, that's right.
I call them the sibling power couple. Yeah.
Yeah, I get their hideous faces confused, but
no, she's blowing up the American education system, and he tried to blow up Afghanistan because he wanted to privatize that war.
Yeah.
Their parents must be so proud, really.
So just in closing, I want to bring it up to where we are now and talk about what Biden recently said with regard to Western imperialism in Africa. He said, after 20 years of American valor and sacrifice, it's time to bring our troops home. But make no mistake, the terrorist threat has evolved beyond Afghanistan since 2001, and we will remain vigilant against threats to the United States, wherever they come from. And this is the last sentence, and I like the confusion here in not realizing that 2 of the countries he names are in the Middle East. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is Islamic State now, IS, are in Yemen, Syria, both of which are in the Middle East, Somalia, and other places in Africa and the Middle East beyond, and in the Middle East and beyond. A little bit redundant there, typical of Biden, but it seems that he is just all in on this imperial adventure in Afghanistan. And in closing, can you comment on that?
Well, I mean, I think that this was a very instructive speech because it was his first, like you said, to a joint session of Commerce on foreign policy. He said the word Africa one time. Mm-hmm. And the only way, and that this shows you that the colonial brain, it is still functioning no matter how polite the language is, and no matter how much the ladies doth protest, right? Or the, the metaphorical ladies in charge. Because we still see Africa. We don't even list African countries, although I guess they listed Somalia, but who knows if people know it's in Africa. They don't really warrant individual cases, individual agency, individual grievances, individual contexts that breed these conflicts. No, they're just an extension of the global war on terror against ISIS. Nowhere in that speech does he say that the vast majority, up to nearly a consensus of experts, believe that ISIS, its affiliates in Africa, have almost zero connection, with one maybe exception, with one half of Boko Haram. With that one half maybe exception, all the ISIS affiliates, and there's several, have basically no connection to IS, just a branding thing. Didn't mention that. Lumped them right in. And Africans don't factor, like I've said, in AFRICOM. They don't factor in Africa policy. It's not about Africans. They only matter as playgrounds or playing fields, or some supposedly as like proxies for these IS groups or Al-Qaeda groups. And so long as we look at African conflicts as a monolith or as a broader extension of a global war that isn't, as long as we connect the unconnected and we are lumpers instead of splitters, we're actually doing like an injustice to African agency and just the value of their lives, because most of these conflicts are highly local. Most of the places the Islamist insurgencies rise, or the rebellions rise that then take on an Islamic flavor, because oftentimes when shit falls apart, like the most extreme folks come to the forefront, right? That's just like psychology and conflict study. Most of the time, the breeding grounds for these Islamist insurgencies are Western-backed governments. And so instead of making a speech and saying, I want to give a speech about Africa that's going to be a pivot, it's going to be a pivot, a paradigm shift in American policy. We are demilitarizing US policy towards Africa. It hasn't worked, folks. Here's the evidence. It actually creates more. It's counterproductive. So we're just out of that game. And now let's talk about Africans. And I'd like to start with Morocco, and I'd like to go around the horn, a pun kind of intended in that case when you get to the East. I'd like to go around the horn and talk about the individual problems in these countries and how we can at least help. We can't do everything. It's ridiculous to think that foreign intervention, even diplomatically or human rights wise or humanitarian aid, can do everything.
Oh, the US can. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, we can do anything, right? If we just believe it enough. Like, what is it? You have to do you have to snap your fingers or something like in Peter Pan? I don't know what you have to do to like make Wendy come back.
Click your heels, Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. But the bottom line is, I mean, what are we doing to change the foundations, the foundational problems and grievances? And they're almost always like economic, ethnic, political, in terms of dictatorship. Again,
but the underlying assumption there is that it's our responsibility or our duty or our self-righteous task to help these backward Africans to get up to speed with the modern world or adopt our preferred brand of democracy. I fail to understand why, besides imperial lust, the US thinks it has any right to tell people in Africa, in any country in Africa, what they should or shouldn't be doing. And
in any country, anywhere.
Exactly.
Anywhere.
Exactly.
We have no moral authority. We have no, it's ridiculous.
Right. And I think this comes from the Samantha Power responsibility to protect R2P, as it's known by its acronym. And it's been exploited way beyond what the initial scope may or may not have been. And I'm not saying Samantha Power and her retinue drafted that with any good intentions. I don't think they did at all, but sort of as a way of trying to humanize regime change and intervention. And it seems it doesn't seem it's happening. Biden's going right along with that. And we see all these people like Samantha Power and Newland et al. Coming back into the fold. And that's very dangerous, because it's not going to be like what happened in Libya the first time. It's going to be Libya times 100 this time. It's going to be it was all out last time, but it's going to be really all out this time. And it doesn't seem like Biden has any interest in stopping that, or even if it's hard to tell if he even knows that something's going on.
Biden doesn't have any independent thinking whatsoever. He does as he's told. He's just a figurehead. It doesn't matter who's president. It's the same agenda.
Right.
I think what you're saying here is super important though, about how like this idea of like Africans as like backward. I mean, whether we use polite language or not, the fact that we only look at Africa as like a place of conflict, it only matters in so far as it fits into our global battle with Russia and China for like pinky in the brain, like take over the world dominance, or of like our purported global war on terror, which is really just a bunch of local conflicts that we made worse and then connected together. Seeing Africa only that way, and then kind of backing tyrants there and being like, well, it's Africa, that's going on, you got to back a tyrant, you know, like that in and of itself is both patronizing, insulting, and paternalistic, which is all the same language that these liberals in the Biden administration who say it just flippantly or just breezily, that they scream about that stuff, about domestic stuff, especially involving race, and they should. But like, in other words, words like agency, you know, got to give people agency, and don't speak of them as entire groups of people as a monolith, and don't be patronizing, and don't be paternalistic, white liberal, right? Well, they'll say all that, they'll parrot that language, but in Africa it's all okay. And I will end on this, and I really do think it's important. And this is a French thing, but it's important because of the way the American media reports it and the fact that we back them in everything they do. France has a big problem right now, which I'm actually thinking is going to be an interesting one that I'm going to write about thousands of former soldiers, including like 20 generals, wrote a letter and published it. This is in April, predicting a civil war if the Macron government doesn't tamp down harder on Islamists and what they called the Banlieue hordes, or the hordes of the Banlieue, which is like, you know, like the permanent ghettos there, largely immigrant or second generation. These people are pretty far right wing, but the French military, most people don't realize this, has a really strong, like there is a strong subculture of right wing. I mean, after all, this is scary stuff, right? And so they predicted a civil war if he doesn't do it. And then, not really all that indirectly, pretty overtly, not all that subtle, they said in this letter, the military's got to step in that case. So they threatened a coup. Legit. Like, I mean, if you read the language, it's pretty overt. It's a big story, right? Should be. Here's the other kicker. They picked a day to release it in April, which just so happened to be the 50th anniversary of the attempted coup against Charles de Gaulle in 1961. That's right. France had an attempted coup. Paratroopers landed in planes, not out of them, on French soil in airports. The military revolted against de Gaulle because de Gaulle said he was going to end the Algerian war and, let Algerians run their own country, that kind of thing. Freedom. They were against that. They were anti-Algerian freedom and independence. De Gaulle was like,
let Palestinians run their own country.
Right. They were losing. De Gaulle wasn't doing it because he's such a nice guy. He was like, look, this is killing us. It's destroying our republic. It's causing divisions within our, our body politic and the people. And we're losing anyway. We can't win. Right. We've already lost in Vietnam by this point. Now we're losing in Algeria. Military was like, we ain't having that. Generals, colonels, they attempted a coup. These thousands of people who signed this, including 20 generals, including guys who used to be the former commander of the French Foreign Legion. I mean, these are big 4-star generals, 2-star generals, 3-star. They threatened a coup, and they chose to release it on purpose on the 50th anniversary of that coup attempt. This is undemocratic. But here's the interesting part about the hypocrisy and talking down to Africans and the cultural imperialism and just viewing them. Macron's government screamed to high heavens about how awful this is and that they're going to go after some of these guys, especially the few that are on active duty. They're going to prosecute them. French media is full. The French establishment, right, the left and right kind of establishment or centrist establishment like Macron are saying this is the worst thing ever, that the military's retired officers, not even active for the most part, would threaten a coup. And it is terrible. 2 days after that letter was released, Macron went to Chad and conspicuously chose to sit next to the anointed extra constitutionally anointed son of a dictator that they backed for 30 years in his basically internal palace coup, where he became interim head of the government, and he's a 4-star general, is 37.
Like
2
the
days
Guaido
after
of Chad.
the president of Chad, so Debbie's son.
I was
How it all connects.
I was making a fatuous comparison. The Guaido of Chad.
Right. No, right. I mean, but this is it. But this really is, I think, an interesting point, because what it proves is that no matter how much, and I'll end on this, like, no matter how much Americans and French liberals or polite conservatives like that, like kind of centrist conservatives say, oh no, we're not like that anymore. Colonialism's over. Stop calling us an empire. We're not neo-imperial. We're not patronizing. No matter how much they say it, deeds, not words. Deeds, not words. And what Macron did there is he said this, and America basically backed it, essentially, even though we were a little tighter with our lips. We weren't as overt as him. What Macron said is, military coups, actual military coups that result in sometimes thousands of deaths, that's okay in Africa. Mm-hmm. In fact, 61% of the coups that have happened in Africa since 1960, which is when most countries became independent, have happened in former French colonies. And France did have like less than half the country. So not only are we okay with coups in Africa, they happen in our countries. We often support them, sometimes we foster them. But if the military dares say that in France, it's a crime. What you're telling me there is, I think it's a crime in both cases. I think it is bad that they're threatening a coup, of course. I'm not really into that. I like, civilian rule and all that. But that is the kicker. That's the rub. You could say all you want, but unless you point that out, and the fact that America does the same thing, I don't want to hear a word about it, Russia in Africa or China in Africa, or I want to know, I guess, because it does matter, but I don't want to hear any more about their malign activities unless we stop ours. I really think that. And
yeah, absolutely. And then we can hopefully talk about this next time, but the French legacy of colonialism is not just coming back to Africa now, but we also saw it in the early 90s with the Algerian Civil War, which you can trace directly to French colonialism, and was a brutal civil war in which babies even were getting their throats cut. And the world barely batted an eye that was happening, even though it was a direct result of Western colonialism, particularly under France. You had the Pied Noir come in and think that they were going to turn Algeria into, I don't know what, their second country, their vacation home. And that led up to what happened in 1992, I believe, was like the height of it. Yeah. And yeah, so, we were talking earlier about echoes and the legacy of these imperial conquests. So it's scary to think about what these current imperial conquests are going to produce in the future, what echoes they're going to produce. But that's a good place to leave it. And we'd love to continue this discussion because it's obviously ongoing.
Of course.
And seemingly never ending. So Danny, thank you so much for joining us. We'll pick up in another episode, the next episode with you, hopefully. And our guest today has been Danny Sjursen. His recent piece at antiwar.com is entitled Debbie's Death, Chad's Crisis, and the Ghosts of Libyan Fiascos Past. And I highly recommend reading it if you want to really get your finger on the pulse of what's happening with AFRICOM and other Western imperial delusions taking place in Africa. And Danny is also co-host of Fortress on a Hill podcast. Is it on a hill or the hill?
Fortress on a Hill.
On a Hill. Fortress on a Hill podcast. And as I mentioned, he writes frequently for antiwar.com. And you can find him at his website, which is skepticalvet.com. And you can find him on Twitter at skepticalvet.
And you have a new book coming out, correct?
I do, yeah. But one word about that. Yeah, June 1st, True History of the United States. It's a bit of a beast. It's written for like a public audience, even though it's long, covers everything, or everything from, about 600 years ago. It should go further back, but it's coming out June 1st. You can pre-order it now. I just got my desk copies, and believe it or not, I mean, if I can, be excited or whatever and self-aggrandizing. It caught a starred review in Kirkus, which is
Nice.
I'm told pretty rare.
Nice. I'm
just
very
always-
excited to read it.
Popping out, and hopefully it'll get some people reading.
Yes.
Yeah. So
definitely.
look for that. June 1st is not far away. And Denny has also written 2 other books, Patriotic Descent and The Ghosts of, is it Baghdad?
Ghost Riders of Baghdad. Yeah.
The Ghost Riders of Baghdad, which was his first book. And Denny has also served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So everything he said here today, and he said on previous shows, he knows what he's talking about. He's coming correct, and we always love to have him on. So Danny, we look forward to talking to you again, and
keep an eye on Gaza, Israel.
Yeah, we would love to actually talk to you about that. We didn't really get to talk
that.
about it today, but we would love to talk to you about that.
Unfortunately, I'm sure that things will deteriorate even further, and I'll be keeping abreast of it. And I have a column coming on Monday on it. So
good. Okay, good. We'll have you back on then.
Is that Layla Khaled on your shirt?
I'm not even sure. I think maybe it might. I just like that it was a female activist kind of. And
yes.
I like to mess with. I like to juxtapose my vaguely bro looks with colors like and activism for causes that no one really mostly cares about. It's fun.
You really are quite a complex character, Danny Sjursen.
I'm either onto something or I'm just wildly self-indulgent in a way, or both. But I hope I'm leaning more left on that one. So, but thanks for having me, guys. It was great.
Great to talk to you.
Absolutely, man. Thank you so much, and we will talk to you again soon.